"You don't deserve to be alone tonight," Margaret said, her car keys trembling in her hand. "Hello, I'm Daniel. I'm 31, work as a technical writer from home, and I've always been the guy who handles things quietly. Not the one who breaks down. At funerals, not the one who needs rescuing, but I watch. I notice things, like how my wife's mother had been crying in her car before coming inside. I grew up in Seattle, married Sarah at 26, and lost her 3 days ago to cancer. Nothing prepares you for that kind of silence. Which is probably why what happened next still feels impossible, even now. Margaret stood in my kitchen as the funeral reception ended. 24 years older than me, composed, careful, "I'll stay," she said. I thought she meant a few hours. She meant something else entirely, but before we begin, let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. I started loading the dishwasher mechanically, grateful for the mundane task. The kitchen had emptied out as the last funeral guests drifted toward the front door, their murmured condolences fading into the November evening. Stacking plates gave my hands something to do, something other than accepting. More hugs or nodding at well-meaning platitudes about Sarah being in a better place. The soft click of sensible heels on tile made me pause. I knew it was Margaret without turning around. She'd been wearing those same comfortable brown leather shoes all day, moving between groups of mourners with quiet grace, making sure everyone had enough coffee, enough tissues, enough space to grieve. When I finally looked up, she stood in the doorway, car keys in hand. Her silver-streaked dark hair had started escaping its neat bun, and her eyes were red-rimmed but composed behind her reading glasses. She'd been our anchor through all of this, the diagnosis, the endless hospital visits, those final, brutal weeks, Sarah's mother, but so much more than that to both of us during the fight we'd ultimately lost. "Daniel," she said softly, studying me with the same careful attention she'd shown all day, "you shouldn't be alone tonight." I nodded, assuming she meant she'd stay for a few hours, maybe organize the casseroles filling the fridge. "Thanks, I could use the help putting things away." My voice sounded strange in the quiet kitchen, too loud against the clink of dishes. She moved closer, taking a glass from my hands and placing it in the dishwasher with practiced efficiency. "Let's get this sorted first, then we'll talk." We worked, in comfortable silence, falling into an easy rhythm. She knew where everything belonged in our kitchen. She'd taught Sarah to cook here, though the lessons never quite stuck. The thought brought an unexpected smile, quickly followed by that familiar ache. Once the kitchen was restored to order, Margaret helped me check the locks and turn off lights, gently steering me toward the living room couch. "Sit," she instructed. "I'll make tea." I sank into the cushions, listening to her move around the kitchen, the kettle filling, cabinet doors opening and closing, spoons clinking against ceramic. The familiar domestic sounds wrapped around me like a blanket, keeping the silence at bay. She brought 2 steaming mugs, setting them on the coffee table before settling beside me. We didn't talk much. She didn't try to fill the quiet with stories about Sarah or ask how I was holding up. She just sat with me, solid and present. As the evening deepened into night, when the grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, she gathered our empty mugs. I expected her to leave then, thought she'd done more than enough by staying this long. But she paused at the front door, something unfinished in her expression as she studied my face. "I'll check on you tomorrow," she said firmly, her tone leaving. No room for argument. Then softer, "Try to get some sleep, Daniel." I watched her taillights disappear down the street, not understanding yet that she meant more than just tomorrow. Not knowing how many tomorrows would follow, each one a quiet rebellion against the loneliness that threatened to swallow me whole that first night. Looking back now, I wonder if she already knew, if she could see past my careful composure to the void waiting underneath. But that's the thing about beginnings, you never recognize them while they're happening. You just know something has shifted, like a key turning in a lock you didn't even know was there. The knocking pulled me from a heavy, dreamless sleep. For a moment, I couldn't place where I was stretched out on the couch, still wearing yesterday's funeral clothes, now wrinkled beyond salvation. The knocking came again, more insistent. 7 o'clock glowed red on the cable box. My body protested as I stumbled to the front door, each muscle stiff from sleeping awkward and twisted. I hadn't even made it upstairs to my bedroom last night. Margaret stood on the porch, a small wheeled suitcase beside her and reusable grocery bags hanging from both arms. The early morning light caught the silver in her hair, now freed completely from yesterday's bun and falling past her shoulders. She wore a soft gray cardigan over what looked like yoga clothes, like she'd been up for hours already. "You look terrible," she said, but gently. "Let me in before these bags break." I stepped back automatically, watching as she rolled her suitcase into the entryway and carried the groceries straight to the kitchen. My brain felt wrapped in cotton, struggling to process what I was seeing. "What's all this?" I managed finally, following her. She turned from where she was unloading fresh fruit onto the counter. "I meant what I said last night, Daniel. You shouldn't be alone through this part." She gestured at the stack of sympathy cards on the dining room table, the manila envelope from the funeral home I couldn't bring myself to open. "The thank you notes, the paperwork, the quiet mornings, it's too much for one person." "Margaret, you don't have to," I started, but she cut me off with a look I recognized. Sarah used to call it her librarian face, the one that brooked no argument. "Sarah would never forgive me if I left you to drown in silence," she said, her voice firm but kind. "And I wouldn't forgive myself either." She paused, something vulnerable flickering across her face. "Unless did rather I didn't stay?" "No, I I ran a hand through my hair, aware suddenly of how disheveled I must look. "I just worry about you. You have your own grief to process, your own life to get back to." She began putting groceries away, moving through the kitchen with familiar ease. "My grief isn't going anywhere, neither is my life." She closed the refrigerator door and turned to face me fully. "Right now, this is where I need to be. Now go shower and change clothes. You'll feel more human. I'll have breakfast ready when you come down." I found myself obeying without further protest, too exhausted to argue. The hot water helped clear my head somewhat, and putting on clean clothes did make me feel more anchored in reality. When I came back downstairs, the kitchen had transformed. Coffee percolated, something savory sizzled on the stove, and Margaret had sorted the sympathy cards into neat piles on the dining room table. "I've started a list of calls we need to make," she said, sliding a plate of eggs and toast in front of me. "But that can wait until you've eaten." "We?" I asked around a mouthful of food I hadn't realized I was hungry for. "Yes, we." She sat across from me with her own plate and a notepad covered in her precise handwriting. "I've taken the guest room, by the way. I'll stay as long as needed." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples of meaning spreading outward. Part of me felt pathetically grateful for this invasion of my grief, this refusal to let me sink into isolation. Another part felt unsettled, wondering what unspoken price we might both pay for this arrangement. That first night, lying in bed and listening to the quiet sounds of Margaret moving around the guest room, a drawer closing, soft footsteps, the whisper of pages turning, I wondered what she was sacrificing to be here. Her condo sat empty 40 minutes away. Her routine, her independence, her chance to process Sarah's death in private, all set aside to shepherd me through this valley of paperwork and empty rooms. I rolled onto my side, watching moonlight paint silver stripes across the wall through the blinds. Down the hall, a lamp clicked off in the guest room. The house felt different with someone else breathing in it, less like a museum of memories, more like something living. I wasn't sure yet if that was better or worse. The days blurred together after the funeral, but Margaret brought a quiet rhythm to them. She never announced her routines, just settled them around me like a comfortable blanket. Every morning I'd wake to the scent of coffee drifting upstairs, following it down to find my mug waiting in the exact spot where I always set it at dinner. She never asked if I wanted any. She just knew. The laundry I'd been ignoring slowly vanished from the hamper, reappearing folded in neat stacks on my bed. Bills and sympathy cards found their way into organized piles. She handled the phone calls I couldn't face, the insurance company, the hospital's billing department, distant relatives checking in. I'd hear her voice from the kitchen, calm and capable, taking notes and asking the right questions while I sat in the living room pretending to watch whatever was on TV. Our dinners were quiet affairs. She didn't try to fill the silence with platitudes or force conversation about my feelings. She just sat across from me, the soft clink of silverware marking time between us. Sometimes she'd mention something practical, a form that needed signing, an appointment she'd scheduled. Mostly we just ate. I found myself studying her when she wasn't looking, noticing how different she was from Sarah, where my wife had been a whirlwind of creative chaos, leaving half-finished paintings and coffee cups in her wake. Margaret moved through spaces with deliberate precision. She never seemed to waste emotion, floating through my house like she'd memorized every corner. Even her presence felt measured, there but not intrusive. You know those evenings when the silence gets too loud? She seemed to sense those too. She'd settle into the armchair with a book, not trying to draw me out, just being there while I stared unseeing at whatever Netflix show was playing. She never asked how I was doing or told me it would get easier. She just stayed. I started listening for her movements around the house, the soft pad of her feet on the stairs, water running in the kitchen, pages turning in the guest room. Another heartbeat in the house. It helped, somehow, knowing someone else was breathing the same air. 2 weeks passed this way, falling into patterns I hadn't agreed to but found myself depending on. Then one evening, as she was loading the dishwasher, she mentioned needing to pick up some things from her condo the next day. "I'm running low on clothes," she said, closing the dishwasher with a quiet click. "And there are a few things I should check on at home." Home. The word hit differently than I expected. This house had started feeling like her home too, in its own way. The thought of it being empty again, even for an afternoon, made my chest tight. "I could drive you," I heard myself offer, surprising us both, "if you want." "I haven't really been out much." She paused, studying me with those careful eyes. "You don't have to, I know." I shrugged, trying to make it sound casual, but maybe it would be good. Getting out of the house. What I didn't say was I don't want to be alone here. Not yet, not even for a few hours. She dried her hands on the dish towel, considering. "All right," she said finally. "We can go after breakfast tomorrow." I nodded, oddly relieved. She returned to putting away the last of the dishes, each item finding its precise place. I watched her reach up to slide a bowl onto the top shelf, the motion smooth and practiced. When had she learned where everything belonged? When had I started taking it for granted that she would know? The evening settled back into our usual quiet rhythm. Her reading, me pretending to watch TV while actually listening to the soft whisper of turning pages. But something felt different, like we'd acknowledged without really saying it that this arrangement had become more than just temporary crisis management. Later, lying in bed, I could hear her getting ready for sleep down the hall. The familiar sounds had become a kind of lullaby, water running, drawers closing, her soft footsteps. The guest room light clicked off, and the house settled into night quiet. I walked through the front door, my suit jacket heavy with late afternoon heat. The lawyer's office had been efficient, but draining. More papers to sign, more decisions about things I didn't want to think about. The house felt different, though. Usually when I came home, Margaret would be in the kitchen or living room, maybe folding laundry or reading. But today, silence filled every corner. "Margaret?" I called out, dropping my keys on the entry table. No answer. I checked the kitchen first, empty, though a half-drunk cup of tea sat on the counter, still slightly warm. The living room was vacant too, her usual armchair holding only the book she'd been reading last night. Something pulled at my chest, an irrational fear that she'd finally decided to leave. Then I noticed the studio door was open. Just barely, maybe 3 inches, but it was the first time I'd seen it that way since before. Sarah's art studio had been off-limits in my mind, a sealed chamber of memories I wasn't ready to face. But there, through the crack, I could see movement. I pushed the door wider, wood creaking against carpet. Margaret sat cross-legged on the paint-stained floor, her back to me. She was holding something, one of Sarah's canvases. Even from the doorway, I recognized it, the beach house from last summer, our final vacation together. Sarah had worked on it between treatments, saying the memory gave her strength. She never finished it. Margaret's shoulders were shaking. She wasn't making a sound, but I could tell she was crying, the kind of deep, private tears you don't want anyone to see. I should have backed away, given her privacy. Instead, I found myself crossing the room. Careful to avoid the scattered paintbrushes and half-empty tubes of color, I lowered myself to sit beside her, our shoulders touching. She didn't startle or pull away. We just sat there looking at the unfinished waves, the suggestion of sand, the beach house window Sarah had outlined but never filled in. She used to sing in the shower, I said suddenly, my voice rough, completely off-key, like spectacularly bad, but so enthusiastic you couldn't help smiling. Margaret made a sound between a laugh and a sob. She got that from her father. Tone deaf. Both of them. And the shoes, I continued, something breaking loose in my chest. Everywhere. I'd find them in the most random places, under the coffee table, behind the TV, once in the refrigerator. She never could explain that one. Oh, God, the shoes. Margaret wiped her eyes, smiling now. When she was 6, she went through this phase where she'd paint all her shoes with finger paint. Ruined at least 3 pairs before I caught on and bought her some canvas ones specifically for art projects. Did she ever tell you about her pun phase? I asked, remembering. She'd save them up all day, then hit me with 5 or 6 in a row over dinner. They were terrible, just ... awful. When she was 16, Margaret said, touching the canvas gently, she came home and announced she was going to art school. Her father wanted business or law. They fought for weeks. But she just looked at me one day and said, Mom, I need to make beautiful things. What could I say to that? She called you, you know, I found myself saying, the day after we met. She was so excited she could barely get the words out. Something about this guy who actually laughed at her horrible jokes. The studio felt different now. Less like a sealed tomb, more like a space where our memories could breathe. Afternoon lights slanted through the windows, catching dust motes and making them dance. Sarah's easel stood in the corner, her palette still holding dried swirls of blue and green from that last beach painting. Margaret set the canvas down carefully. She loved you so much, she said softly. Even at the end, when everything hurt, she'd light up when you walked into the room. I felt tears sliding down my face but didn't bother wiping them away. I miss her terrible cooking, I whispered. How is it possible to miss something that bad? Speaking of her cooking ... Margaret stood slowly, offering me her hand. I know where her recipe box is. The one with all my notes in the margins, trying to teach her. We could ... we could make something, if you want. I looked at her hand, then up at her face. Something had shifted between us, sitting here among Sarah's unfinished dreams. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it felt less like drowning and more like swimming, maybe. Together, I took her hand, letting her pull me up. Yeah, I said, I'd like that. We stood in the kitchen, Sarah's recipe box between us on the counter. It was one of those vintage metal ones, robin's egg blue with a dented lid. Margaret opened it carefully, like she was handling something precious. These are all the ones I tried teaching her, she said, thumbing through the cards. Though tried is the operative word, I pulled out a recipe card at random. Chicken piccata, the paper spotted with olive oil stains. Sarah's hurried handwriting crammed the margins. More garlic! And don't forget to pound chicken first, learned hard way. Below that, in Margaret's neater script, Sarah, capers optional but traditional. Traditional. Read it aloud? Margaret suggested, already moving to the fridge. I know it by heart, but I'd like to hear it. So I did, letting Sarah's notes and Margaret's corrections tell their story while we gathered ingredients. Margaret moved through the kitchen with natural grace, knowing exactly where everything lived. I'd watched her cook for weeks now, but this felt different, less like she was taking care of me, more like we were creating something together. Slice garlic, I read, and Margaret handed me a cutting board. Not too thin, she said, bumping my elbow gently, Sarah used to practically puree it. We fell into an easy rhythm. Margaret chopped parsley while I heated olive oil, the sharp herb scent mixing with warming garlic. When she reached past me for the wine, her cardigan brushed my arm. Little moments of contact that I found myself anticipating. "Salt," I said, reaching for the container just as Margaret did. Our hands met over the ceramic salt cellar. Neither of us pulled back immediately. Her fingers were warm against mine, and for a heartbeat, maybe two, we just stayed like that. Then Margaret turned back to the pan, stirring the sauce, but I could see a slight flush on her cheeks. "Sarah burned the first 3 batches of this," she said, her voice soft with memory. "She was so determined to get it right. I think she went through an entire chicken learning to pound the cutlets evenly. The kitchen filled with the smell of butter and wine and lemon, familiar and new all at once. Margaret told stories while we cooked, Sarah at 12, trying to make breakfast in bed for Mother's Day and setting off the smoke alarm. Sarah in college, calling home in tears because she couldn't boil pasta properly. Sarah at 26, finally mastering this very recipe and bringing it to Sunday dinner. So proud she practically glowed. I found myself laughing, actually laughing, at the image of Sarah wielding a meat mallet like Thor's hammer. It felt strange in my throat, rusty from disuse, but good. Real. We ate at the kitchen table, the warm yellow light making everything soft around the edges. Margaret's hair had started escaping its bun, dark strands curling against her neck. She'd rolled up her sleeves while cooking, and I kept noticing the delicate bones of her wrists as she reached for her wineglass. "This is better than Sarah's version," I admitted, then felt guilty. Margaret smiled. She'd be the first to agree. She never quite got the sauce right, always too much lemon or not enough butter, but she kept trying. That was Sarah, always. Reaching for better. After dinner, we stood side by side at the sink, me washing while Margaret dried. The routine felt different tonight. Every time our hips bumped reaching for dishes, every brush of fingers passing plates between us, sent little sparks of awareness through me. I found myself hyper-conscious of her presence, the subtle scent of her shampoo, the warmth of her arm against mine, the quiet harmony of our movements. "Last one," I said, handing her a wine glass. Our fingers touched longer than necessary, water droplets connecting our skin. "Thank you," she said softly, and I knew she meant more than just the dishes. When she finally headed upstairs, I watched her climb each step, suddenly wanting to ask her to stay. We could watch one of the old movies she loved, or just sit together, like we usually did. But the words stuck in my throat, heavy with meaning I wasn't ready to examine. I stood at the bottom of the stairs long after she disappeared, trying to pinpoint when her presence had shifted from comfort to necessity. When had I started tracking her movements through the house? When had her touch begun lighting up my nerve endings like this? The kitchen still smelled of lemon and herbs, and Sarah's recipe box sat on the counter, full of memories and margin notes. But for the first time since the funeral, I was thinking more about the present than the past. I noticed the changes gradually, like watching a flower slowly unfurl. Margaret's carefully maintained routines began softening around the edges, her precise timing giving way to a more natural rhythm. The first time I saw her hair down, cascading past her shoulders in waves of silver-streaked black, I almost dropped my coffee mug. She'd been rushing to answer the phone, her usual neat bun abandoned midway through styling. "Sorry about the mess," she said later, gathering it back up. "It looks nice," I said before I could stop myself. "I mean, you don't have to put it up on my account." After that, she wore it loose more often, especially in the evenings. It made her look younger somehow, more relaxed. Or maybe she just was. More relaxed, settling into the house like she belonged here. She started staying up later too. Instead of retreating to the guest room after dinner, she'd curl up on the couch with her crossword puzzles while I watched TV. Her reading glasses would slide down her nose as she concentrated, and sometimes she'd ask me random clues. 7. Letters, morning reaction? She'd say, tapping her pen against her lip. Yawning, I'd answer, and she'd smile, filling it in with her precise handwriting. I found myself making her tea without asking, remembering exactly how she liked it, Honey, stirred in while it was hot, no milk. She never commented on it, just accepted the mug with a soft thank you that felt weighted with something more. Our conversations deepened during those quiet evenings. She told me about her years as a librarian, the joy of connecting students with just the right book. Her eyes lit up describing the places she wanted to visit, small bookshops in Edinburgh, cafes in Paris, temples in Kyoto. I always thought I'd travel after retirement, she said one night, tucking her feet under her on the couch. But then Sarah got sick, and nothing else mattered. You should still go, I said. Sarah would want that. She looked at me then, something unreadable in her expression. Maybe someday. I found myself sharing things too, frustrations with my software development job, the growing distance with my parents who never understood why I didn't want to join the family business. Things I'd kept separate from Sarah's family before maintaining that polite barrier between in-laws. Parents can love you and still not see you, Margaret said, understanding in her voice. It took me years to accept that with my own father. We started watching old movies together, her favorites from the 40s and 50s. She knew all the trivia, whispering behind-the-scenes stories about the actors. I found myself watching. Her reactions more than the screen, the way she mouthed favorite lines, how her eyes crinkled when she laughed. One night, during Casablanca, I noticed her responses getting slower, her head nodding slightly. Before I could suggest she head up to bed, she drifted off completely, her head tilting until it nearly touched my shoulder. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing, afraid to wake her. The lamp cast soft shadows across her face, peaceful in sleep. Her hair brushed against my arm, impossibly soft. It felt dangerous, how right this moment was. How much I wanted to let her rest against me, to feel her warmth seeping through my shirt. I should wake her, send her up to proper bed. Instead, I watched Ingrid Bergman say goodbye to Humphrey Bogart, hyper-aware of every small movement Margaret made in her sleep. Finally, as the credits rolled, she stirred, blinking in confusion. When she realized where she was and how close, she sat up quickly. "Oh God, I'm so sorry," she said, smoothing her hair self-consciously. "I didn't mean to fall asleep on you." "It's fine," I said, missing her warmth already. "You should feel comfortable here. You've made it feel like home again?" She looked at me strangely, something flickering in her eyes that made my heart skip. Then she stood, gathering her crossword book and glasses. "Good night, Daniel," she said softly, and climbed the stairs. I lay in bed that night, sleep impossible, replaying every moment of the evening. The way she'd shifted closer during the movie, not quite touching but nearly there. How she'd looked in sleep, years falling away from her face. The expression in her eyes when she'd woken. Did she feel it, too? This gradual transformation from caretaker to something else? Something we hadn't named yet, might never name. Something that made my skin prickle when she passed too close, that made me notice the curve of her neck when she bent over her. Puzzles that made me want to reach out and brush that escaped strand of hair behind her ear. I turned over, punching my pillow into submission. These thoughts were dangerous, impossible. She was Sarah's mother, here out of kindness and duty, wasn't she? But I couldn't shake the memory of her almost touch, the weight of her gaze, the way she'd started letting down her careful walls. Like she trusted me, like maybe she wanted something more too. The storm rolled in just after we'd finished washing the dinner dishes, a massive front that turned the evening sky an eerie green. The first crack of thunder made the windows rattle, and seconds later the house plunged into darkness. "Stay where you are," Margaret called from the kitchen. I know where Sarah kept the emergency candles. I heard her moving with surprising confidence through the dark house, cabinet doors opening and closing. Using my phone's flashlight, I found my way to the garage where I kept a box of camping supplies. When I returned with batteries and flashlights, Margaret had already created little islands of candlelight throughout the living room. "The radio says it could be hours," I said, setting up a battery-powered lantern. "Tree down on a main transformer." Margaret nodded, arranging candles on the coffee table. "We should make the best of it." "Oh," she paused, something occurring. To her, "I know what we need." She disappeared into the dining room and returned with a bottle of wine I recognized immediately. Sarah had bought it on our honeymoon, saving it for some future celebration. 5 years it had sat in our wine rack, waiting for a moment that never came. "Are you sure?" I asked, my throat tight. "Sarah would hate knowing it went unshared," Margaret said softly. She looked different in the candlelight, the harsh edges of grief softened. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, and without her reading glasses, her eyes seemed darker, more open. I found a deck of cards while she opened the wine. We sat at opposite ends of the coffee table, dealing hands of gin rummy like we had so many evenings before. But something felt different tonight. Maybe it was the storm isolating us from the world, or the wine warming our blood, or the way the candlelight created shadows that seemed to erase the careful boundaries we'd maintained. After her second glass, Margaret set down her cards. "I never told you about my divorce, did I?" I shook my head, afraid to break whatever spell had made her willing to share. 20 years ago, she said, tracing the rim of her glass. Sarah was in college. Her father, he was a good man in many ways, but he had a talent for making me feel invisible. Like I was just furniture in his life, something useful but unremarkable. The thunder growled outside, rain lashing the windows. I woke up one morning and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt truly seen, so I left. She smiled, but it held old pain. Everyone thought I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was. But it saved me. I watched her in the flickering light, seeing the strength it must have taken to rebuild herself alone. Something in my chest ached, not the familiar grief, but something warmer, more dangerous. "I feel guilty," I heard myself say. Not just survivors. Guilt, though there's plenty of that. But guilty because I'm not only destroyed. Because sometimes I notice things, feel things that seem like betrayal. My eyes met hers across the candles. Like how your laugh does something to my chest, how I watch for it now. Margaret reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were warm from the wine glass, slightly trembling. "Grief isn't linear, Daniel. Feeling moments of life doesn't betray Sarah. She'd be glad to know you're not drowning." I turned her hand over, my thumb tracing the lines of her palm. We sat like that, connected by that small touch, while the storm raged outside. The candles burned lower, creating a world that felt separate from reality, from proper boundaries and careful distances. "We should move to the couch," Margaret said finally, her voice hardly above a whisper. "More comfortable for talking." I looked at her, really looked at her, knowing we were approaching something that couldn't be undone. The candlelight painted gold across her cheekbones, caught the silver threads in her hair. She held my gaze steadily, letting me see the question in her eyes. "Yes," I said. "Let's move to the couch." We settled onto the couch, closer than we'd ever sat before. The empty wine bottle stood sentinel on the coffee table, surrounded by guttering candles. Margaret tucked her legs beneath her, shifting until her knee pressed against my thigh. The contact felt deliberate, a tiny point of warmth that spread through my whole body. "You make the fog lift," I said, watching shadows dance across her face. "When you're here, I feel present, like I'm actually in my body again, not just floating through the days." She turned toward me, and in the candlelight, I could see the subtle flush on her cheeks, whether from wine or something else, I wasn't sure. Her hair fell forward, and she tucked it behind her ear with slightly unsteady fingers. "I'm feeling things I shouldn't," Margaret admitted, her voice low and careful. "Things that complicate why I'm here, what I'm supposed to be for you, right?" Now, she looked down at where our legs touched, then back up to meet my eyes. "This is probably wrong." The last word was barely a whisper, but it hung in the air between us, heavy with possibility. "Everything feels wrong now," I said, finding courage in the storm-dark room, in the way she didn't move away. "Everything except this, except you." My hand moved of its own accord, cupping her cheek. My thumb brushed across her cheekbone, feeling the soft skin there. Margaret's eyes fluttered closed, and she leaned into my touch, just slightly. Just enough, I don't remember deciding to kiss her. One moment I was watching the candlelight play across her features. The next I was tasting wine on her lips, breathing, in the subtle scent of her shampoo. She was softness and warmth and possibility, a future I hadn't known could exist anymore. She pulled back first, her hands resting on my chest. "Daniel," she said, my name careful on her tongue. "We need to." "Be sure, is this just grief? Just needing someone?" I appreciated her honesty, her need for clarity. I owed her the same. "I don't know what this is," I admitted, running my fingers through her hair, watching how it slipped like silk between them. "But I know I haven't felt this alive in months. This real." Margaret studied my face in the flickering light, her eyes moving over every feature as if memorizing it. Something shifted in her expression, settled into certainty. "We go slow," she said, one hand coming up to touch my face. "We stop if either of us needs to. This isn't," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "this isn't something to rush through." When she kissed me this time, it felt different, deliberate, a choice we were both making with clear heads, despite the wine, despite the storm-created bubble around us. Her lips parted against mine, deepening the kiss in a way that made my heart race. We stayed like that, trading kisses and quiet words as the candles burned lower. Margaret's hand found mine, our fingers intertwining. Between kisses, she told me about her fears of judgment, of complicating the grief process. I confessed. My own confusion, how attraction and guilt tangled together in my chest. "I don't want to lose you," I murmured against her temple. "Whatever this becomes," she squeezed my hand. "I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure it out together." The storm continued outside, but in here, in this candlelit sanctuary, we created our own weather. Each kiss felt like a question and an answer. Both, each touch wrote new possibilities between us. When the last candle sputtered, leaving us in darkness, broken only by occasional flashes of lightning, Margaret was curled against my chest, her breathing steady and calm. My fingers traced patterns on her arm, and neither of us seemed inclined to move. I woke to sunlight streaming through the living room windows. Alone on the couch where Margaret and I had spent the night talking and kissing, the power was back. On the ceiling fan spun lazily above me, and I could hear the refrigerator's familiar hum. More importantly, I could hear Margaret in the kitchen, humming something I didn't recognize. My body ached from sleeping awkwardly, but my heart felt strangely light. I stood quietly, following the sounds of domestic morning activity. I paused. In the doorway, watching her work. Margaret moved with her usual precise efficiency, cracking eggs one-handed into a bowl while keeping an eye on the coffee maker. She'd changed clothes, fresh blouse, hair pulled back, but not as severely as usual. Something had shifted in her demeanor, though. A softness around her edges that hadn't been there before. I walked up behind her, careful to make enough noise that I wouldn't startle her. When I wrapped my arms around her waist, she tensed for just a moment before relaxing back against me. The familiar scent of her shampoo mixed with coffee filled my senses. "This isn't about being lonely," I said quietly, needing her to understand. "And it's not about Sarah, it's about you, Margaret. About who you are, what you've come to mean. To me." She set down the whisk she'd been holding and turned in my arms, still gripping a spatula in one hand. Her eyes searched my face with an intensity that made my breath catch. "I need to go home," she said finally, the words gentle but firm. "I need to think, to make sure we're not just holding each other up when we should be learning to stand on our own." Everything in me wanted to argue, to beg her to stay. But I understood what she meant. We'd both been drowning in different ways these past weeks, and finding each other had been a lifeline, but was it more than that? Could it be? "I know," I said, even as my arms tightened slightly around her waist. "I don't like it, but I know you're right. I know you're right." Margaret lifted her free hand to my face, her thumb brushing across my cheek in a mirror of last night's touch. "I'll call you in a week," she promised. "Not as Sarah's mother, not as your caretaker, just as Margaret. And we'll see if this still makes sense in the light of day, away from storms and wine and grief." I nodded, letting her go when she gently pulled away. We ate breakfast together, the air between us charged with unspoken words. The eggs were perfect. As always, Margaret had a way of making even simple things feel like care. After we cleaned up, she went upstairs to pack. I could hear her moving around the guest room, the soft sounds of drawers opening and closing. When I went to check on her, she was folding each item of clothing with careful precision, smoothing wrinkles that weren't there. "Let me help you carry things down," I offered. Not ready to let her go just yet, she smiled, handing me a small bag of toiletries. "Always the gentleman," she said, and something in her tone made me wonder if she was remembering last night. How careful we'd been with each other. At the front door, Margaret set down her suitcase and turned to face me. The morning light caught. The silver in her hair made her eyes warm and deep. She stepped close, rising slightly on her toes to kiss me once, softly, like a promise. Then she was gone, walking to her car with that same deliberate grace she did everything with. I watched from the doorway as she loaded her bags, as she slid behind the wheel. She waved once before backing out of the driveway. I stood there long after her car disappeared around the corner, already counting the days until next week. The house felt emptier than it had since Sarah died, but different now. Not the emptiness of loss, but the emptiness of waiting, of possibility. 7 days. I would wait 7 days to hear Margaret's voice, to know if what had sparked between us could grow into something real. Something chosen, not born of grief or obligation or loneliness, but of genuine connection. I closed the door finally, turning to face the quiet house. Her coffee mug still sat in the dish drainer, and I couldn't bring myself to put it away. The week without Margaret stretched like taffy, each day both endless and incomplete. I went through the motions of living, showing up at work, nodding at concerned colleagues, buying groceries that didn't feel worth cooking just for myself. Every morning I noticed the absence of her coffee mug on the counter, the missing stack of completed crosswords on the side table, the way her reading glasses no longer caught the afternoon light. I kept my promise not to call, though my phone felt heavier in my pocket each day, weighted with unsent messages. Instead, I thought about that night during the storm, the warmth of her lips, her fingers threading through my hair, the way my name sounded different when she whispered it. Thoughts of Sarah came too, sharper now with this new context. Would she understand? I drove to the cemetery on the 4th day, sat by her headstone, and talked to her about her mother, about how Margaret's quiet strength had become something I couldn't imagine living without, about how guilty and alive I felt all at once. "You always said I was terrible at being alone," I told the silent stone. "You made me promise not to become a professional widower. But I don't think this is what either of us expected." On day 6, I cleaned the house from top to bottom, something frantic in my movements. I wanted everything perfect, just in case. The guest room still smelled faintly of her shampoo. When my phone rang at exactly 7 o'clock on the 7th evening, my heart jumped. Margaret's voice came through clear and steady, with a warmth that made me close my eyes. "I'd like to take you to dinner tomorrow," she said. "Somewhere new. Somewhere that can be just ours." "Yes," I answered, my voice catching on that single word after we hung up. I sat in the quiet house, feeling the strange lightness of permission to live, to want, to begin again. Tomorrow felt like a door opening. I arrived at Salvatore's 10 minutes early, pacing the brick sidewalk outside. When Margaret's car pulled up, my breath caught. She stepped out wearing a deep blue dress I'd never seen, her silver-streaked hair falling in soft waves instead of her usual bun. She looked like a stranger I desperately wanted to know. Inside, we stumbled through, ordering drinks, both too aware of what this evening meant. Our waiter brought bread, and we reached for it simultaneously, our hands colliding. Margaret laughed then, a genuine sound that broke through our careful politeness. "We're being ridiculous," she said, shaking her head. "I already know how you take your coffee." That broke the ice. We talked about everything except Sarah and grief-safer territories of books and dreams and personal histories. I learned Margaret had played piano seriously until college, kept a collection of vintage science fiction paperbacks, and once spent 3 weeks driving solo from Maine to California. Her eyes lit up describing the desert sunrise in Arizona. She leaned forward, wine glass forgotten, as I told her about the furniture pieces I built in my garage, my disastrous attempt to learn French in college, and my shameful secret of never learning to ski despite living an hour from the slopes. Each revelation felt like offering up pieces of myself I'd forgotten existed. After dinner, we walked downtown, streetlights creating pools of gold on the autumn sidewalks. Her hand found mine, fingers intertwining naturally. She stopped at a quiet corner, turning to face me. "I talked to my therapist this week," she said softly. "Made sure this wasn't just complicated grief. It's not. This is something else, something real." I pulled her close, kissing her under the glow of an antique lamppost. We agreed to take things slow, to date properly, to build something deliberate and honest, but standing beside our cars later, neither of us moved to leave. "Coffee?" Margaret suggested, her keys jingling softly. "At your place?" We both knew she wasn't really asking about coffee. 3 months after that first real date, I stood with Margaret in the hallway, carefully hanging the last of Sarah's paintings. The morning light caught the brushstrokes, beach scenes, abstract sunsets, fragments of the life before. Margaret held the level while I adjusted the frame. Our movements synchronized after months of learning each other's rhythms. She'd moved in properly last week, her books filling the empty shelves, her coffee mugs mingling with mine in the cupboards. This time she brought everything, not just the emergency suitcase from those first grief-soaked weeks, but the full texture of her life. We dated like people with time to spare, trying new restaurants, discovering movies neither had seen, taking weekend drives through coastal towns where no one knew our story. The paintings felt different now. Not shrines to what I'd lost, but acknowledgments of the path that led us here. That evening in the kitchen, we moved around each other with practiced ease, preparing a new recipe we'd found together. Our own history now, separate from Sarah's recipe box. I watched Margaret at the stove, thinking about our routines, how she claimed the window seat each morning for reading, how I brought her chamomile tea each night, how naturally we'd merged our separate lives. When we told Sarah's family, there had been raised eyebrows, whispered concerns, but mostly, surprisingly, support, understanding. Later that night, Margaret traced lazy patterns on my chest, talking about tomorrow's plans, garden, work she wanted to start, dinner with friends we now shared as a couple. Through the window, I watched Dawn's slow approach, breathing in her familiar lavender scent so different from Sarah's preferred vanilla, distinctly Margaret's. I held her closer, understanding how grief and love could share the same space. How finding Margaret hadn't erased my loss, but had given me room to hold both the sorrow and the joy, the memory and the present, all of it part of who we'd become. If this chapter felt like it was meant for you, subscribe and ring the bell tomorrows. Maybe the hand you didn't know you were reaching for.